And I'm the, or it's just telling me. I'm Mark McKenna. I'm the director of the Notre Dame Technology Ethics Center, and along with my colleague Elizabeth Reneris, the director of the Notre Dame IBM Technology Ethics Lab, I'm very happy to welcome you to the first talk in our spring speaker series. Our series this spring focuses on the role of technology in promoting mis and disinformation, the ethical problems involved, and the technical, legal, and institutional responses best suited to our modern challenges. These are obviously enormously important questions right now, and we have a really world-class group of experts lined up for you. Academics, practitioners, and activists who are facing these challenges from a variety of different perspectives. We're very lucky to have Dr. Joan Donovan kick off our series today. Dr. Donovan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's one of the world's leading experts in internet and technology studies, and particularly studying online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaigns. Dr. Donovan leads the Technology and Social Change Project, which explores how media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. Dr. Donovan's talk today builds on a recent piece she published in the Harvard Business Review titled How Social Media's Obsession with Scale Supercharged Disinformation. She's going to talk for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have some time for questions, so please feel free to send in those questions. Joan, thanks very much for being here. I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. I'm just updating the title because for some reason it reverted. But it's really great to be back and very excited to chat about these issues related to scale and social media, but also I think, the implications of a global communication commons is something that I'm interested in diving into in terms of the discussion later. And I'm hoping just to give you some ideas of things to think with, examples that you might not be super familiar with at this stage, but I think, the example that I'm going to show you today about some very recent research that we put out on Friday, that there was a parallel investigation happening at WAPO. So we were trading notes with journalists, trying to make sure we got the most thorough accounting of this conspiracy to say essentially that COVID-19 was a bioweapon. So we're going to talk about cloaked science. We're going to talk about the ways in which openness is at issue. And openness really only works as a kind of value on the net when scale is the measure by which you judge everything, including profits. I'm just going to share my screen here and kick this off. And hopefully I'll wrap up around 12:30-ish, and then we can get into discussion. And as we go along, I'm probably not going to be able to see the chat while I do this, unfortunately. So just kind of bear in mind, if you're chatting, I probably am not going to be able to answer questions live. Everything looks okay with the screen? Okay, we're great. So I titled today's talk, Everything Open Will Be Exploited. And so the idea here is just following along with some of the themes in the article that I wrote for Harvard Business Review right after the January insurrection. I was very angry as a researcher, to be honest with you. And I say that in my politest voice, because if I were to express my feelings about that kind of anger, I might not have a job very much longer because it would be fueled with expletives. But what I was angry about was essentially that we could see it coming. We saw ratcheting up violence happening. The rhetoric online was matching the horror shows that were playing out in front of several different state capitals before we get to what happened in DC. And through it all, as a researcher, I was both angry that there was not a lot of recourse from government, not a lot of help that could be done. And there was, in some ways, a willful desire not to know the scale and the problems that were sort of lurking within platforms and lurking within social media. So at the same time that you have a bunch of civil society organizations, university researchers, journalists, all, banging the drum saying there is a problem, it is on its way, it's getting worse. The fake news crisis of 2016 was just a minor note in the history of the last several years of social media compared to what we're facing now, which Facebook has termed real world harm. And for someone like me, all I'm left to think with is, what other kinds of harm is there, right? But we're still living in this age of digital dualisms where what people do online somehow doesn't count in real life, right? And of course, that has a lot to do with the speech norms in the United States in particular, and matched with a kind of can't happen here mentality about violence and people's stated intentions. I'm not going to talk too much more about what happened then, because I want to take us into another example of serious harm that is happening. There's a different, similar set of players, but a little bit different. And I just want to ratchet up the stakes a little bit by talking about medical misinformation and how problematic it is for people to receive medical misinformation when they're looking for accurate, timely, local, relevant information, because that medical misinformation at the right time could lead you to change your behaviors, your health behaviors. So it's going to be really important that we think through what it is that we legitimate online and how we distribute that kind of information. Some definitions. When we talk about media manipulation, media is an artifact of communication. Could be notes, it could be a JPEG, a documentary, a textbook, literally any of the detritus, the leave-behinds of communication. And so we happen to primarily study digital media, but don't be alarmed to find out, but there is no communication without misinformation. And so there's actually misinformation everywhere. The point, though, is to try to understand how it scales, how it reaches new audiences, and in particular, how we are being manipulated. So manipulation is to change by artful or unfair means so as to serve one's purpose. So we leave artful in there for our friends, the hackers and activists that will do some shenanigans in order to call attention to an issue. Usually those shenanigans are not harmful, and the point is actually to reveal some kind of brokenness in one of our systems or institutions. And then the other kind of definition I want you to be thinking about is disinformation. That is the creation and distribution of intentionally false information for political ends. And we can have a little bit of a discussion later about in what ways does the case study I present today about the Yan report point us to this new category of potentially medical disinformation. Haven't quite got there with the definition yet, so I'm trying out a new shtick with y'all. So bear with me as we try to work it out. But I think what we're dealing with is a different kind of political category when medicine and our medical health and our public health are being used as a kind of political weapon. And a couple of other things that are just hanging around in my brain lately, which I think help us set the stage for what is new about this. Network conspiracy. So when we talk about QAnon or other groups online, the Truther movement, for instance, networked groups, I like to think about these as networked conspiracies, which, like urban legends, networked conspiracies provide moral tales that explain confusing events. And a lot of things kind of fall into this online, which is to say that something happens and a person offers a speculative answer to that, and then that speculative answer somehow goes viral and becomes, the sort of new what next for internet conspiracists and new rabbit holes to travel down. And one of the ways this happens is actually through meme wars, which bring ordinary people into contact with disinformation in the form of networked conspiracies like hashtag QAnon, hashtag Plandemic, hashtag Biden crime family, which was the hashtag that was supposed to be associated with the Hunter Biden laptop fiasco. And of course, Stop the Steal, which was a very vast and large network conspiracy across all platforms in the open web to lodge this meta conspiracy about the election being rigged. So when I make reference to those kinds of terminology, that is what I mean when I talk about media manipulation, disinformation, network conspiracy, and even hashtags as a kind of meme. So the way that we study this is actually fairly new in the sense that we've built a website, mediamanipulation.org, and we have a theory methods package there, as well as nearly 20 case studies at this point for you to cruise through. But what's important about how we study misinformation is that we think about it in a life cycle. And so we often are looking for 5 points of action when we're writing up a case study. That is, where's the campaign being planned? Second, where is it being seeded across the open web and platforms? So, with Stop the Steal, for instance, it's important to go back actually to 2016 and look at Roger Stone, who had originally lobbed the idea towards Trump's campaign in the anticipation that Trump was actually going to lose, in the anticipation that he was going to lose and would need to say that the election had been rigged. Second, we look at that development. How does it stick around? How does it move around on social media? But the third is when we most often actually take notice of a disinformation campaign. That is to say, when people respond is usually when it becomes a thing. That's when it actually scales. And that's what's important of thinking about. Why scale matters here is because if nobody responds and someone is just wrong on the internet, which happens every day, I guess the big key here is not to be the one that is wrong and achieving scale. That is, you don't want to be that person on Twitter that everybody's focused on that day. Which is to say that we really look at the responses by the industries that are affected, activists, politicians, journalists, that is, people who have audiences online and can, make the piece of disinformation or the network behind it seem more important than they are. For mitigation, for a long time, we didn't have anything to put in that category. 2016, lots of questions from platform companies about why they should care about white supremacists. There were just such a low proportion of the content. And so why would you worry about 0.0001%? And my response was obviously like, are you crazy? Like, they're going to ruin you. Which is to say that since then, I usually just offer up the retort that if you leave disinformation to fester, it will infect the whole product. And I think I've been proved right more than a few times since then. But mitigation can also be a journalist debunk. It could be the field clapping back on someone and saying, this is not true according to us. And then lastly, we look at the adjustments by manipulators to the new information environment. We look at, well, what are they doing differently based on mitigation? Did they drop the campaign? Did they pivot? Did they start it up again on a new platform? And increasingly, we're also looking at the adjustments by some of those platforms post-attack. How do they develop new policies, for instance, that label media, and how do they build rules around deplatforming so that it's not so uneven in terms of the actual execution of the either ban or removal of a hashtag, for instance. Like, for instance, Biden crime family, Twitter very early on during the New York Post laptop story took away, like, if you search for Biden crime family, you didn't get any responses. And so they took away that element of connectivity. A little bit of theory, just a little bit. Bear with me. It's just important that we all kind of get on the same page about social change and how do we build technology? What is innovation for? I often go back to this book by Chris Kelty, written in 2009, practically before the telephone was even invented, so long ago. All we had were two clamshells and a piece of seaweed to communicate with. I kid. It wasn't that long ago, but it feels ages ago. I'll tell you, last week feels like 10 years ago. Nevertheless, Kelty's 2 Bits, The Cultural Significance of Free Software, gives us a good way to think about how innovation happens. He writes, geeks fashion together both technology, principally software, hardware, networks, and protocols, and an imagination of the proper order of collective political and commercial action. That is, of how economy and society should be ordered collectively. And so when I think about this, I think about, well, when you're building a big system, you're not just going to build the system. You're also going to think about, well, how is this system going to interact with the world? How is it going to interact with the economy? And, throughout the years, there's been a lot of hubris in tech about changing the world, right? Our technology is going to change the world. And then it was sort of like, well, maybe it's not going to change the world, but it's certainly going to be disruptive. And then it was sort of like, oh, like that's the worst kind of disruption ever, because the rest of us actually need a little bit of stability. I'm getting a little bit of is it gone? Yeah, it's gone. Sorry, I was getting an echo. I was thinking about recently in a paper, I guess recently is relative, with Tony Nadler and Matt Crane about, well, what is the technical and moral order of social media? And so we wrote this bit on the digital influence machine because I really wanted to look at, well, what are the technical ways in which we're being ordered? What is the way in which our internet and platforms are relating to each other? Who are the actual customers here? So we wrote, the digital influence machine is the infrastructure of data collection and targeting capacities developed by ad platforms, web publishers, and other intermediaries, which includes consumer monitoring, audience targeting, and automated technologies that enhance its reach and ultimately its power to influence. And when we were writing this, I was very struck by Safiya Noble's algorithms of oppression, because one of the things that she points out is how the backbone of the internet is largely based on advertising. And as a result, you get a certain kind of search as it relates to those kinds of products. And as data capture and data harvesting has become in and of itself its own business, we just have to be wary that it's not necessarily that we're building an information commons. We're building an advertising system that blankets the world, right? And whoever owns the gates to that advertising system, especially who gets to enter and then what they get to see, they actually have a much bigger influence on our politics and our society as well as our economy, because of that facilitation of coordination, like massive social coordination that happens. And you can see that in companies like Amazon, for instance, how it doesn't matter to them what they sell. They just want to sell everything, right? And for Facebook, it doesn't matter to them what kind of user you are. They just want to produce connectivity everywhere. And so it's important to think about this in the sense that they're not recognizing themselves as essentially services, and certainly not advertisers. And so as a result, we don't get great information services. We don't have any public interest obligations that insist, yeah, with your social media, you're going to get a little bit of timely, local, relevant, and accurate information like you would if you turned on the radio. Because on the radio, even though the DJ does not want to stop playing Rihanna to say, hey, there's going to be a city council meeting later today, there are laws that make it so. Those are called public interest obligations. But over time, that's how we ended up with, rock stations having these intermediary interruptions to help folks that listen to them know what was happening in their city or town. And so we can think about things like that as different ways of intervening on our tech and innovation system, so that when people are looking for really important information, like how do I get a vaccine or what is coronavirus, they actually get accurate information, rather than whatever is popular that day or whatever someone paid to have some advertising on. So who actually pays for social media? My answer to this is always we do, which is not the adage that says, oh, well, if the product is free, the product is you. And I get it. It's cutesy, but it's not actually what's at stake here. It's what's at stake is not individuals and their uniqueness. We're all, digital snowflakes. However, data only matters in the aggregate. My data, Mark's data, Elizabeth's data, it only matters together. And that is in a relationship with other kinds of data. And so the political question about platforms is a really interesting one in the sense that what we need to push for is a field of people who do data science, political science, sociology, anybody that's part of critical internet studies. We actually have to kind of force a political conversation on these platforms and about technology in a lot of ways, because by and large, they really want to avoid any kind of politicization of the thing they sell, which is essentially aggregated data. And so in 2019, as the political question started to fall on Facebook, Zuckerberg says, I don't think it's right for a private company to censor politicians in a democracy. And that's my impression of Mark Zuckerberg. Thank you. Good night. No, I'm just kidding. It's a pretty good one. But it was basically this. We're not going to touch them. They're not going to mess with us, right? Very, very flat, affectively. At the same time, across the highway, Twitter saying, actually, we're going to ban political ads because if you want attention, you should have to earn it. And that, of course, opens up these dark markets for all kinds of shenanigans related to media manipulation, disinformation. And then later, Facebook in January 2020 doubles down again and says, in the absence of regulation, Facebook and other companies are left to design their own policies. We've based ours on the principle that people should be able to hear from those who lead them, warts and all. Of course, that is a statement about politicians, in a sense, saying, essentially, you can be the worst kind of troll, and we're going to let you use our products. And that is really the setup conditions that led us to where we ended up at the onset of the pandemic. So one of the things that vexed me about the onset of the pandemic is how few guardrails were in place, as well as how few, we're still staying with the road metaphors. I mean, this is supposed to be the information superhighway, and you can't get people accurate information about COVID-19. Like, the best you can do is a sticky at the top of your page, right? This was a tragedy in March as schools were shutting down, as people were getting sick, as government was trying to get an action plan in order. And, for all the failures of the Trump administration, there were folks inside the CDC and in other government agencies that were trying. But by and large, we end up in this position because the people that have taken up so much of our revenue and advertising space, these are now huge companies without any commitment to public obligations related to information. So I got very, very interested in the question of where did it come from? We still don't know definitively where COVID-19 came from, but questions like that as a search string become a networked terrain for disinformers. And so early on, where did it come from? Every slur you could find in the book about China, Chinese Americans. We saw an uptick in violence and hate crime. But one thing started to strike me was very strange is we started to see a lot of different scientific articles. And so I wanted to understand that. So we came up with this idea of thinking, let's look at cloaked science. Let's look at things that look like science, but aren't. So our definition is this: the use of scientific jargon and community norms to cloak or hide a political, ideological, or financial agenda within the appearance of legitimate scientific research. This may include the use of technical language, difficult to understand graphs and charts, or seemingly scientific data presented as empirical evidence to lend credibility to the claims being made. Cloak science may be seeded into public preprint servers, in data repositories, journals, or publications with lax review standards through press releases or by baiting journalists who may not be able to scrutinize the claims thoroughly. And so I'm going to go through and show you how this happens according to the life cycle. So early on in the pandemic, January 25th, this article starts making the rounds. It's from G News, which is a well-known anti-CCP, anti-China news outlet that primarily publishes in English and in Chinese, but it's mostly for what appears to be an American audience. And they write, breaking news, China will admit coronavirus coming from its P4 lab. And then later it says Miles Guo identified the Chinese scientist Dian Guo to be the person who created the Wuhan coronavirus. And then it says the vice president of China ordered this attack. This, of course, is completely fake, but it's traveling through Facebook. QAnon networks are exponentially sharing it because there's finally some explanation for what's happening. You should know that Miles Guo is a backer of Steve Bannon. He gave Steve Bannon $100 million. Can you imagine what it'd be like to run a center if you had $100 million? I mean, I'd spend it all in a week, but we'd have some awesome research. But that $100 million is basically for Steve Bannon to build this rule of law foundation with Guo. And the point is to ensure that there is news circulating in the United States that is against the CCP. That's really the big mandate for Bannon accepting that kind of money. So this is January. And then what we start to see is this woman starts to pop up on YouTube in a few different ways. People are talking about this dissident scientist that knows that COVID-19 has been made in this lab. And in July, she shows up on Fox News in a couple of different ways. And in this breaking news segment, they say Hong Kong scientist says supervisors covered up her potentially life-saving COVID-19 research. So that's important here because Guo and Bannon actually went to Hong Kong and flew her back to the United States and then started to put her in front of right-wing news. On the left and in the center, we haven't found any interviews with her that were not ones that seemed to be arranged by Guo and Bannon and those networks. So the next stage is actually what we're most interested in, which is this science paper posted on Zenodo, which is a preprint server, or scientific archive is what they prefer, on September 14th, 2020, with this very jargony title, Unusual Features of the SARS-CoV-2 Genome, suggesting sophisticated laboratory modification rather than the natural evolution and delineation of its probable synthetic route. You see these numbers? 1 million people looked at a scientific preprint. That, to me, as a researcher, is like alarm bells. Something's happening here. Most of these papers get, like, you're a rock star scientist if you get 800 downloads on your preprint. Like, you're literally the best in the field. So this is unusual, an anomaly, and should have tipped off Zenodo that they were being gamed. Here is the views, and you can see this spike very quickly. So the views are in blue, the downloads are in red. But the day that it goes up, you see this huge spike. And, over the first 3 days, you get nearly a majority of the looks at the paper. So what we did was we went and looked at, well, where was this happening? So the paper comes out on the 14th. She hits the media on the 15th. Tucker Carlson covers the story saying, Chinese whistleblower to Tucker, this virus was made in a lab and I can prove it. Peter Navarro tweets, he's a White House Trump advisor at the time. A Chinese scientist is called in to investigate a deadly virus in Wuhan. That's not true. She was a postdoc. Finds some troublesome facts, is muzzled by the CCP, flees for her life to the US. Doesn't mention that she was flown here by Steve Bannon. Speaks her own truth and then is muzzled by the Free America social media. Where's the outrage? Which is to say that at that time, and we don't have any public record of why Twitter made this decision, but Twitter did take down Jan's account. So Jan is the name of the young woman. And they took down the long links to this paper on Zenodo. And they did it rather quietly. So their mitigation was not meant to cause a stir, but that's what's animating the background of these discussions. But the big mitigation comes actually when John Hopkins and a number of other scientists actually debunk it. And I'm talking like 10 pages, like sentence by sentence, just tear apart. Like if I got a paperback from reviewer 2 like that, my career as a sociologist, I would question it. So, people in the field are saying no. And then Facebook also adds a interstitial on Tucker Carlson's links to his interview with Jan. And all the while, she starts realizing that what she's saying is not just controversial because of what it contains, but is controversial because of the networks of people she is involved with. And in Washington Post on Friday, which I'll post a link in the chat, they actually interviewed Jan to find out why she went with Zenodo and why she was was receiving a stipend from Steve Bannon. And she had no idea he was that controversial. She just wanted to get this word out. And I found that partnering with WAPO on this story actually made it a lot better in terms of our research, but also the verification process was very, very thorough on both ends. So I thought that was a really important part of the story. But the other thing that happened and is crucial is that in the adaptation phase, you had Jan go back and she basically wrote a very similar paper on October 8th, but she just changed the title so that you know what she's talking about. SARS-CoV-2 is an unrestricted bioweapon, a truth revealed through uncovering a large-scale organized scientific fraud. This is a little different than trying to cloak the science, right? This is obviously, in the loosest of ways, would fall into social science, but is really a press release. And then later, she does it again on Zenodo. She posts November 2nd, 2020, November 21st, 2020. CNN used lies and misinformation to muddle the waters on the origin of SARS-CoV-2. So she's obviously just using the open science platform in order to launch any kind of attack against anyone that she perceives to be a threat to her point of view. But something interesting really happens after that, which I want to call your attention to, which is after working with WAPO and talking with Zenodo, Zenodo has decided that it is going to now mark anything that's on their platform with a flag now that says that this is potentially misleading content. Now, whether that's going to feed into platform companies and how that this flag here is going to link into how they perceive the problem, who knows? But what it's left me with thinking about is just this moment where we're in this moment where I'm almost having deja vu of the fake news crisis, where I'm saying everything open will be exploited. You have to think about what it means to run a platform. You have to care about the community that is engaging with the things you're hosting. And what that actually implies is reducing the scale to a human level where you can be good stewards of information. Of course, that is terrible for business. So I close by saying this: like secondhand smoke, misinformation damages the quality of public life. Every conspiracy theory, every propaganda or disinformation campaign affects people, and the expense of not responding can grow exponentially over time. Since the 2016 US election, newsrooms, technology companies, civil society orgs, politicians, educators, and researchers have been working to quarantine the viral spread of misinformation. The true costs have been passed on to them and to the everyday folks who rely on social media to get news and information. So thank you so much. I'm going to shut down my screen share and let's do some questions.
Thanks very much, Joan. There's so much there. I'm going to start with one question and then I'll let Elizabeth go, which has to do with the sort of the effectiveness of some of these mitigation strategies like the flags, right? So, I mean, in my own sort of social media thing, you get, these little things that pop up that tell you something about the first circulation of an article, or, whether it's potential disinformation. And what do we know about the effectiveness of those things on users at all? And then, I guess relatedly, given that the narrative that some people use is about this disinformation is the way they're being silenced, it becomes sort of a martyrdom. Like, are those flags in some cases having sort of like the opposite of the intended effect?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. There was some promising data out of Twitter that suggested that when things were flagged, the click-through was a lot less, as well as the sharing was a lot less in terms of retweets. But then also on Facebook, sorry, I misspoke. On Facebook, when they put up that interstitial, the click-throughs were a lot less. So they are having the intended effects in the sense that you're getting less sharing, so less scale. The badge of honor, a trophy for my misdeeds. Those are very popular things on, like in thinking about the anonymous message board 4chan and how much they love to hoax a journalist. And then when the journalist has to issue a correction, how fast that screenshot will circulate. However, I think if the goal is reducing scale and reducing the harm, then I think we're headed in the right direction. But ideally, for something like this, when you go through and you have a university set of researchers confirming alongside journalists, alongside a bunch of other public health officials saying this medical misinformation in the On report is terrible. I would have liked to see some stronger measures taken. But I have to tell you, these kinds of interventions require time. Like I did a very similar thing with research about medical misinformation that was happening on Medium. So Medium, people could post things, then they were being shared on Twitter as if they were like from epidemiologists, and you find out, oh, they're not even like an epidemiologist. They kind of moonlight as an economist, maybe they're a Bitcoin guy. But when Medium took the step of removing that medical misinformation, what people did was they started to share the Internet Archive link. And so the Internet Archive actually had to come up with a way to improve the context under which someone would see a link on the Internet Archive. And that caused quite a bit of uproar. People were saying, you shouldn't be able to do that. Whose facts are these? But everything is contextual, but I do think it does matter that we at least try to improve the information quality on the internet, as it's becoming the de facto place to get information. So it's not like, my solution isn't like tell everybody to go to the library. The solution has to kind of match people's ideas about where and what information is online. And so I think for me, Zenodo is modernizing, but they're not quite fully there because they don't really have the staff to implement any other kind of strategy.
Elizabeth, you want to go next?
Sure, and thanks so much, Joan, for being here. Provocative as always. I wanted to go back to a few things you said at the beginning of your talk about how we could see it coming, and there was a kind of willful disregard for what we saw coming. And I would push you on who the we is here. And I do think a lot about the work of Dr. Satya Nobel and thinking about sort of whose heeds and whose warnings about the house on fire matter, and how we make them matter when we're up against incentives, business models, a desire for scale, valuing scale, and when we're up against sort of the forces that are basically aligned and incentivized to ignore those warning calls. And if you have any recommendations for how those of us who are working on mis and disinformation can think about how to make those calls heeded.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you think about social change and how it happens, you have to have very strong social institutions that can exact some kind of sanction on the other social institution so that things stay within a certain kind of relative balance. But over the years, journalists who used to be able to kind of put tech in check have been rendered ineffectual. In some instances, they've been essentially turned into content moderators because they find the worst of the worst long before platform companies know. Government has been rendered relatively inert by 230, Section 230, which is the policy that, depending upon how you read it and how drunk you are, apparently, as a lawyer, you can see a lot of different things. It is like the most strange thing to talk to lawyers about, because there's one side of the camp that says, well, it actually helps with content moderation. It says, we're going to release you from any liability if you just do the right thing. And then on the other side, there's this idea that, well, it actually means that you should do the bare minimum content moderation so that everybody has access to the freedom of all of the things. I kind of land in the middle where I feel like it helps, social media become a McDonald's at 2 a.m. Like, there are things you can get away with, but by and large, there's a bunch of stuff you can't say, can't do, and you got to kind of follow the rules or you're going to get kicked out. But if we had a strong legal framework to enact sanctions, things would be different, especially if the government could levy serious penalties. As well, civil society. I work with this group called the Disinfo Defense League, It's nearly 400 civil society organizations that are either mostly racial justice, gender justice, get out the vote campaigns. Many of them had been calling attention to the issue of the violence on December 12th, especially the Black Lives Matter banners that had been stolen from Black churches and burned on the streets of DC, and no one got arrested for that. But those banners in that burning was actually a kind of nostalgic callback to the days of the Klan, right? Like fire and media optics. And so if we had reacted then with a very harsh set of penalties in terms of law enforcement reacting, maybe things would have been different, because you saw the Proud Boys sort of at the front line breaching the gates. Who else knew? Academic researchers, we've known for a decade now that social media has a kind of twin possibility. One is a future in which it does help people find their voices. It does help people who are alone and isolated find people who are like them. I'm thinking here about patient groups that have, this very small amount of people with that certain disease, and how important it is for them to be able to reach out and find other people like that. But because of the business plan over the years, where more is better, it's really just kind of corrupted any idea of community that we could have had thinking about social media. But I say all that just to say that there are a broad swath of folks that wanted things to be different and have tried to rein in some of the feature sets on these platforms, and nothing was getting done in any significant way. Temporary fixes cause bigger problems. And for the last 4 years, we've just seen lots of temporary fixes that didn't, weren't strong enough to combat like the full force of Bannon and Trump and Giuliani and all of these other folks that used the enormous audiences they had on social media alongside a bunch of other networks in order to force this lie about the election into the world.
Okay, so I'm going to try to cluster a few questions together. Hopefully this will be artful enough for you to make sense out of. But the questions are kind of about are there particular characteristics of the sorts of things that become disinformation in terms of either the supply or the demand side? So just for example, is it important to the sort of flourishing of a piece of disinformation that it's sort of filling a vacuum, right? That it's answering a question that people have, that there isn't a good answer coming from. So might things have been different in terms of the disinformation about the pandemic if the government and the president in particular had been forceful in sort of promoting good information out there, so that there really was not a sort of obvious lack of information? Or relatedly, are there particular kinds of styles of disinformation that are much more likely to sort of take root? I think all of which may be going toward a question of how might the platforms, if they were motivated to do it, more accurately predict this is a place where we might expect disinformation to flourish.
Yeah, so it's promising that Facebook hired Ben Nemo, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, from Graphica, in the sense that it points us towards what they might be trying to do at Facebook, which is actually get at the second piece of your question about styles of disinformation campaigns, which is that by and large, the ones that go big fast do so because there's actually a very small network of people who have, large, so there's a small group of people with very large networks that are, influencers, usually within Trump's orbit, that can quickly make something happen because they coordinate with major media outlets as well as coordinate a ground game in social media, and use the open web, right? They'll often plant a piece of information over here and then pretend to cover it. So the Yan report is just one example, but the Hunter Biden laptop is it's almost the exact same story. It's Bannon and the New York Post talking about the crimes and the, pornography and the drug abuse on this laptop, that then we're supposed to believe isn't disinformation. It's just Hunter Biden forgot his crime-ridden laptop at this, mom and pop shop in computer repair shop in DC. Like, it's stuff like that styles of disinformation. If you look, you don't have to look far, but within cybersecurity literature, this kind of hack and leak operation is normal. And it's very much a Bannon style. But Facebook, was kind of late in the game, removing networks that Bannon had also ginned up that were like supercharged networks on Twitter as well as Facebook. And so they were known as the Himalaya networks. If you're interested, there's a couple of articles out there about them. But by and large, yeah, if you get at the styles of disinfo, and that's what we're trying to do with the casebook, is actually tell you, here's what the tactics are, here's what the patterns look like, here's who the players are. And just like years ago when we were trying to get action on platform companies to care about white supremacists and remove some of the more dangerous folks from the alt-right that were making a lot of money using social media to promote themselves. There are other ways in which we could do that. And my team, we don't have, any extra tools. We don't have any gifted data sets. We don't have any purview or sneak peek into these platforms. We do all this work artisanal, right, by hand. But it's ethnography, right? So you have to get into the mess, which makes me think about this question that you had about the supply side and what Dana Boyd and Michael Gobieski called data voids, which is that there are going to be places where a key word is the kind of hook that allows people to find the rabbit hole that brings them into disinformation. So, for instance, for years, if you typed QAnon in, there wasn't a lot of other things you'd find besides actual conspiracy theorists. Like, the question is, at what point do you do that kind of explainer? Who does it? Under what conditions? And can you do it responsibly, in the sense that the worst thing you could do is just hand the microphone over to one of these conspiracists and say, tell us about QAnon, which unfortunately is like a lot of the ways in which some journalists operate, because what they don't realize that they're doing is they're platforming those ideas. And a lot of them try to like sneak in a bunch of different keywords and things that might entice other people. We've been through this before. Before it was QAnon, there was, the whole uproar around incel, and like, do we need to know what an incel is? And so the data voids question is a tough one, because it really depends upon who, what, under what context, and can they do it responsibly.
Liz, we'll probably have time for one more if you have another one.
We can keep Joan here all day, and we can turn back to the questions that have come in. We may not have enough time, but there is a question about whether or not the platform should allow Trump back. Joan, I don't know if you have a quick view on this one.
Yeah, no, I don't know. It's a tough one, because he's definitely menacing, and social media is that's the right feature set for menacing, is give someone a microphone and like let them tear off into the wilds, and say whatever they want to say. The hard part is he's got a growing group of people that are literally willing to die for him. That's different than, your regular use case. And I've tried to think through this question multiple different ways, but it seems to me like when someone enters the category of a politician and they are a representative, that there should be a terms of service and a set of rules that require them to be good stewards of information, be responsible users of the platform and megaphone that they've been given, and that there are very clear rules about incitement, harassment, hate speech. I don't know if anybody even remembers this. Remember that day Trump retweeted that video of the old guy in the golf cart going by some Black Lives Matter protesters saying white power? Oh, the president couldn't hear him. He just thought it was cool. This guy was in a golf cart, right? Like, come on. That's like racial terror for like many of our friends who are, either, Black or indigenous people of color. Like, you can't let that happen when it's your technology that is spreading the awfulness. And so I think about those kind of moments a lot, right? These kind of minor notes in the history of Trump's social media that make people scared and that require accountability that we're never going to get. And so if I let me just say this, if I owned Facebook, I wouldn't let it happen. And I wouldn't let it happen because I cared too much about the people who were on the other end of that kind of ire and disrespect. I would care too much about my bottom line, which is to say that, a lot of people are probably going to leave Facebook over it. Is it going to actually affect their bottom line over time? But I do think that there's a big, broad question we have to answer about, when do these companies become publicly obligated to ensure that timely, local, relevant, and accurate information is being distributed? And then when do they fulfill their twin objective, which is ensuring that there is some kind of community safety for the rest of us who are not world leaders, who are not billionaires, who are not going to be protected by the locks on our doors when like a mob comes for you, right? And this is like what's scary about all of the networked harassment, all the things that we've seen social media be able to produce when it can coordinate a crowd to do such damage. And so for me, I would say if I cared about having a company in 5 years, I definitely would err on the side of caution and responsibility. Which is all to say that I don't lose hope here in the sense that I do think our internet is quite magical in the sense that it has brought me into contact with all of you today. And I do think that it can be used in a way that serves the public interest rather than serves the interest of the powerful. And that's all I try to explain with my research is like, how do we get the public what they need out of our technology? How do we get journalists what they need? How do we get public health officials what they need? How do we get our political house in order? And I do think that technology has a remarkable capacity to be repaired. And I think that that's where we need to go.
Well, that's a great hopeful note at the end. Elizabeth is right. We could have kept you here all day, but we promised everybody, including you, that we would be out of here by 1. But thank you for a great start to our series, and obviously also every time just such a rich, interesting conversation. I just also want to thank Kelly Mitros and Nicole Mackley and the ThinkND team for coordinating today. Like I said, this is the beginning of a series. We have a whole host of additional talks this spring. You can sign up for the whole series at the ThinkND website, and hopefully you'll join us for the next one. Thanks, Joan, for being here. We appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Joan.
Have me back anytime.
Will do.